The river beneath the bridge was cold, its dark waters seething like a living thing waiting for its moment. The wind carried the smell of damp and rust, clinging to the unfinished beams that stuck out of the concrete like bones from a wound. Alexey Ivanov stood at the edge of the construction site, his coat fluttering in the wind, his boots sunk in mud and sawdust. He was 43, but his wrinkled face seemed older, as if time had carved its marks on it. His eyes, grey and heavy, looked at the bridge. His bridge, that was supposed to connect the two banks of the city, but now seemed only a reflection of his own fears. 30 years ago, when he was still a boy with skinny knees, Alexey witnessed something that is not forgotten. The old bridge, rusty and creaking, was then the only way across the river. He was standing on the bank, hiding behind the bushes, when he saw a man, tall, in a long coat, who stepped onto the railing. The man froze, looking down, and his shadow, stretched out in the moonlight, trembled on the water. And then he jumped. Alexey did not have time to scream, did not even have time to breathe. The body disappeared into the river, leaving only circles that parted and disappeared. No one came, no one looked, and the boy remained standing, feeling how the fear of heights gnawed at him like rust into metal. From then on, he avoided bridges, but fate, as if mocking him, made him an architect, a man who builds them. Now he was designing a new bridge, a symbol of progress for a city choked by old roads and traffic jams. His plans were perfect, every beam, every bolt calculated with a precision that bordered on obsessive. But standing here, on the edge of the abyss, Alexey felt his palms sweating, his heart beating unevenly as if it were trying to escape from his chest. He hated heights. He hated this bridge, but he couldn't take his eyes off its arch, rising above the river like the skeleton of a giant about to collapse. The day was gray, the sky oppressive with low clouds that threatened to rain. Workers scurried around, their voices drowned out by the hum of cranes and the pounding of hammers. Alexey stepped closer to the edge, his boots slipped in the mud, and he froze, clutching the railing. The cold of the metal burned his fingers, and for a moment he saw not the construction site, but that old bridge, that night, that man. He shook his head, driving away the vision, and forced himself to move on, to the trailer where the documents were kept. The room smelled of coffee, tobacco, and damp clothing. Alexey sat down at a desk piled high with blueprints and opened a folder of reports. His pencil-used fingers flipped through the pages, but his gaze caught on a line that shouldn't have been there. The materials, steel, concrete, fasteners, didn't meet his specifications. Instead of high-strength steel, the documents listed a cheaper kind, with markings that made his chest freeze. He read it again, thinking it was a mistake, but the numbers weren't lying. Someone had switched out the materials, and it wasn't an accident. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the air in the shed grow thicker. Outside, workers were hauling beams, their faces tired but indifferent, as if they had seen nothing but their paychecks. Alexey remembered the conversation he had overheard that morning. The foreman, old Pyotr, grumbling about shortened deadlines and orders from above. At the time, it had seemed like ordinary chatter, but now Pyotr's words sounded like a warning he did not want to hear. He walked out of the trailer, his steps heavy, as if the mud were dragging him down. The sun had disappeared behind the clouds, and the bridge seemed even darker, its shadow falling on the ground like a stain that couldn't be washed away. Alexey felt something inside him tighten, as if the river beneath the bridge was whispering his name. He knew he should check his documents again, talk to someone, but fear, not of heights, but of something bigger, had already taken root in his chest. He returned home late, when the city was already drowning in twilight. His sixth-floor apartment smelled of dinner and children's paints. Dima, his 10-year-old son, sat at the table drawing a bridge, the one with the arches that looked like wings. Alexey froze, looking at the drawing, and felt the cold creep under his skin. Maria, his wife, put a plate in front of him. Her hands were warm, but her gaze was anxious, as if she saw the shadows he brought home. He smiled, but the smile was empty, like the windows of unfinished houses. That night he lay awake, listening to the wind knocking on the windows. His thoughts returned to the bridge, to the documents, to the line that haunted him. He remembered the boy he had been, standing on the bank, and the man who had disappeared into the river. He had been unable to do anything then, but now he had a choice, or so it seemed. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind them was not empty. It moved, whispered, pulled him down toward the water where it all began, and where it all might end. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The bridge was far away, but its shadow seemed to reach the houses, covering everything he loved. Alexey knew that this was not just a construction site, not just a job. This was his destiny, his abyss, and he had already taken the first step towards it without even realizing it. Somewhere deep in his soul, the boy who had seen death was still standing on the shore, and his fear was alive, like a river that never stopped. The light in Alexey's office was dim, as if the lamps were tired of fighting the grayness that seeped through the windows. Blueprints were piled high on the desk, their edges curled as if trying to hide secrets he had begun to suspect. His graphite-stained fingers leafed through the documents, but his gaze clung to numbers that didn't make sense. Grades of steel, volumes of concrete, signatures he didn't recognize. Alexey sat motionless, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock breaking the silence, counting down time that was slipping away like sand through his fingers. He felt that the bridge, his bridge, was no longer his, and the river beneath him whispered of betrayal he couldn't yet prove. A week had passed since he had noticed the discrepancies at the construction site, and since then his mind had become a trap, where every thought led to new questions. He hadn't spoken about it to anyone, not to Maria, whose warm hands touched him with increasing anxiety, not to Dima, whose drawings of the bridge now seemed prophetic to him. But the silence was as heavy as the concrete slabs that the workers were laying on the supports. Alexey knew he had to act, but every step forward was a step into the darkness, where his fear of heights mixed with something new, the fear of the truth that could destroy everything. The morning began with the smell of damp asphalt rising from the street. Alexey drove to the construction site, his car bouncing over the bumps, the radio hissing with snippets of news about city projects. He turned it off, not wanting to hear the lies that flowed from the airwaves like water from a leaky pipe. The site was noisy. Cranes creaked, workers shouted at each other, and the river below grumbled, as if displeased with their presence. Alexey walked around the piles of rebar, his boots leaving tracks in the mud, but he did not look at his feet. His gaze was fixed on the bridge supports that rose from the ground like the columns of a temple built to deceive. He spotted Pyotr, an old foreman whose hands were scarred from decades of work. Pyotr stood by the shed, his eyes as faded as old glass, looking past him. Alexey approached, feeling the air between them grow thicker. He didn't ask directly. He knew direct questions were as dangerous here as live wires. Instead, he began to talk about the weather, about deadlines, about how the river was interfering with the work. Pyotr nodded, but his lips twitched as he muttered something about the people who decide for us. Alexey froze, his fingers clutching the folder of plans, but Pyotr had already turned away, walking toward the workers, as if his words might catch up with him and punish him. That day, Alexey stayed at the construction site after his shift. The sun was setting, painting the sky crimson, like blood that had not yet been spilled. He climbed up to the platform where the boxes of materials were, his footsteps echoing loudly on the metal. The height was pressing on him, his breath was ragged, but he forced himself to walk, clinging to the railing that was cold as ice. Below, the river glistened, its surface a mirror that reflected not only the clouds, but his own fear. He opened one of the boxes, his hands shaking, and saw what he had feared. The steel was not what he had ordered. Its surface was stained with rust, thin as a spider's web, but deep enough to portend trouble. He pulled out his phone, his fingers sliding across the screen as he snapped pictures. Each click of the camera was a shot in the silence broken only by the river. He knew it was no mistake, no accident. Someone had deliberately switched the materials, and that someone was higher than he could reach. Alexey pocketed the phone, but his heart was pounding, as if the bridge had already begun to crumble beneath him. He turned to leave, and at that moment he noticed a shadow, tall, motionless, standing at the edge of the platform, where the light from the lanterns did not reach. His throat tightened. He took a step back, but the shadow did not move, only watched, like a predator waiting for its prey. The descent was long, each step sending pain through his knees, as if the altitude were punishing him for his courage. When he reached the ground, the shadow had disappeared, but the feeling of its gaze remained, like a burn on his skin. Alexey got into the car, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and drove home, not turning on the radio, not looking in the mirrors. He was afraid to see something other than his reflection there, a shadow that followed him like his past. The house was quiet. Only the ticking of the clock in the living room reminded of the time that was inexorably moving forward. Dima was asleep. His drawings lay on the table, and the bridge on them seemed alive, its arches curved like the back of an animal. Maria sat by the window, her hair falling on her shoulders, and her fingers tugged at the edge of the curtain. She did not ask where he had been, but her silence was louder than words. Alexey approached her. His hand touched her shoulder, but she did not turn, and he felt the distance between them growing, like a crack in concrete that was not yet visible, but already fatal. He lay down on his bed, but sleep did not come. His thoughts swirled around the bridge, around the rusty steel, around the shadow that had seen him. He remembered the boy he had been standing on the bank, and he knew that that fear had never gone away. It had only waited, like a river that patiently eroded its banks. Alexey knew he had to dig deeper, but every step forward was a step closer to the abyss, and he wasn't sure he could hold on when it opened up before him. The basement of the old office building smelled of mold and abandonment, as if time had stopped here, leaving only the echo of strangers' footsteps. Alexey Ivanov sat at a rickety desk piled high with folders, their yellowed edges a reminder of the years that no one had touched these papers. A single lamp, suspended by a bare wire, flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts that knew more than he did. His fingers, roughened by pencils and nerves, leafed through documents stolen from the company archives at night when the guards dozed and the river outside the window grumbled like a witness that it would not give away the secret. A month had passed since he had seen the rusty steel at the construction site, and since then his life had become a narrow path over an abyss. He did not tell Maria about the shadows he had seen, about the photographs he kept in an encrypted file on an old laptop. But her eyes, dark and anxious, noticed how he flinched at every rustle, how his hands shook when he drank coffee. Dima, their son, was increasingly silent. His drawings of the bridge became less frequent, but cracks appeared in them, thin, almost imperceptible, like those Alexey found in his conscience. He knew that the truth he was looking for was a burden that could crush not only him, but everything he loved. The basement was his refuge, a place where he could breathe without feeling the eyes that followed him on the construction site, in the car, outside his house. He found forged invoices signed with names he didn't recognize, but whose titles, director, inspector, stuck into him like nails. Money flowed through ghost companies, their names mocking stability, progress, unity. He wrote out amounts, dates, addresses, his handwriting uneven as the pulse that beat in his temples. Each sheet was evidence, but evidence against whom? He didn't know the faces, only the shadows that moved behind the scenes, manipulating the bridge like a puppet. Morning came with the smell of gasoline seeping through cracks in the floor. Somewhere upstairs, a truck was being refueled. Alexey rose from the basement, his back aching, his eyes burning with fatigue. He decided to meet a journalist he had found through an old acquaintance. His name was Oleg, a guy with sharp cheekbones, and a look that saw more than he said. They agreed to meet at a diner on the outskirts, where the windows were cloudy with dirt and the customers were as tired as the city. The diner smelled of burnt oil and cheap beer. Alexey sat in the corner, his coat hanging over a chair, a folder of copies of documents lying under the table, pressed down by his foot, like a secret that couldn't be released. Oleg arrived late, his jacket damp from the light rain that had begun outside. Alexey handed him the papers, his voice quiet but firm, as if he were afraid the words might break. Oleg flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed, and Alexey felt a spark of hope, for the first time in weeks, that someone would share his burden. But hope was as fragile as glass. 3 days later, Oleg stopped answering. His phone was silent. His messages remained unread, and the editorial office where he worked said he was taking a vacation. Alexey knew it was a lie, like the signatures on the invoices. He returned to the basement, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying not only the folders, but also the weight of Oleg's disappearance. He leafed through the documents again, looking for a mistake that could explain everything, but he found only new threads that led into the darkness. That evening, he returned home earlier than usual. Dima was in his room, his voice coming through the door, reading a book out loud, as if words could protect him from the world. Maria stood at the stove, her movements mechanical, like a person afraid to stop. Alexey noticed how her fingers trembled as she cut vegetables, and he realized that she knew more than she was saying. He approached, his hand on her shoulder, but she pulled away, her gaze as sharp as the knife in her hand. He did not ask, afraid of the answer, but the silence between them was louder than a scream. That night, he was awakened by a sound that did not belong in the house. It was not the creaking of floorboards or the knocking of wind on the windows. It was breathing, heavy and close, as if someone was standing by the bed. Alexey opened his eyes, his heart beating so loudly that it drowned out everything. The room was dark, but in the corner where the shadows thickened, he saw movement, slow, almost imperceptible. He reached out to the nightstand where the knife lay, but his fingers encountered emptiness. The shadow disappeared, but the sound of its steps remained, like an echo that does not fade. In the morning, he found a note tucked under the door. The paper was rough, the letters hastily cut out of a newspaper. "Stop or lose everything." Alexey stood clutching the sheet, his fingers white, and a coldness growing in his chest that was worse than any fear of heights. He looked at Dima, who was eating breakfast, at Maria, who was avoiding his gaze, and realized that the truth he was carrying was not salvation, but a sentence. The bridge was almost finished, its arches towering over the city like claws ready to cling to the sky, and Alexey knew that time was running out, like water in a river that never returns. The night smelled of iron and fear, its silence deceptive like the calm before a storm. Alexey Ivanov crept along the fence of the construction site, his shadow sliding along the rusty bars, bending as if alive. The streetlights flickered, their light dying in puddles that glittered like eyes watching his every step. In his coat pocket lay a flashlight, old and heavy, and in his hand a phone, its screen the only beacon in this darkness. He shouldn't be here. Not after the note, not after the shadows that invaded his home, but the bridge pulled him like a magnet that draws steel to its doom. A day had passed since the note had appeared under the door. Its words, "Stop," or "Lose everything," burned into his memory like a brand. He hadn't shown it to Maria, didn't want to see her face, already pale, grow even paler. Dima, their son, had grown quieter, his voice once clear, now an echo in the empty house. Alexey felt his family slipping away, like sand carried away by a river into its depths. But he couldn't stop. The truth he had unearthed in the basement was too heavy to leave in the shadows. The forged bills, the rusty steel, the journalist's disappearance, all of it was links in the chain that was tightening around his throat. He climbed over the fence. His coat caught on the barbed wire, the fabric splitting like his hopes. The construction site was deserted, the cranes stood motionless, their silhouettes like gallows waiting their turn. Alexey turned on his flashlight, its beam trembling, picking out pieces of rebar that stuck out of the concrete like bones. He headed toward the bridge supports, his steps almost silent, but his heart pounding so loudly it seemed the river could hear him. He knew he had to find proof, not for himself, but for those who might still walk across this bridge, unaware that it was built on a lie. The pillars towered above him, their concrete cold and rough as the skin of a dead man. Alexey ran his hand over the surface, his fingers finding a crack, thin but deep, like a wound that would not heal. He pointed the beam of the flashlight, and the crack came to life, its edges glistening as if wet with blood. He took a step back, his breath catching, and in that moment he heard a sound. Not the wind, not the river, but the crunch of gravel under someone's shoe. He turned off the flashlight. The darkness closed around him like jaws, and he pressed himself against the pillar, feeling the cold of the concrete penetrate his bones. The footsteps were approaching, slow, sure, as if their owner knew that the prey would not go anywhere. Alexey held his breath, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly that the screen cracked, but he did not notice. he saw only a shadow, long, distorted, moving along the ground like a stain that could not be washed off. It stopped a few meters away and the silence became unbearable, like a scream stuck in the throat. Alexey felt the sweat trickling down his temple, his fear of heights, old and familiar, mixing with the new. Fear of being caught, fear for those who were waiting for him at home. The shadow moved on, its footsteps receding, but there was no relief. Alexey switched on the flashlight again. Its beam darted toward the support, and he saw something that made him freeze. Scratched into the concrete next to the crack was the letter I. His last name, crudely carved, a warning that did not require words. He stepped back, his foot caught on the reinforcement, and he fell, the flashlight rolling along the ground, its light dancing like crazy. Alexey crawled, his hands shaking, but he forced himself to stand, pick up the flashlight and take pictures. Cracks, letters, supports that no longer seemed supports, but coffins ready to receive their occupants. He ran toward the fence, his breath ragged like the fabric of his coat. He cut his hand as he climbed over, blood dripping to the ground, but he didn't stop. In the car, he sat looking at his palms, where dirt had mixed with blood, and he realized that the bridge was not just a project, but his trial. He knew he had to hand over the pictures, but to whom? The journalist had disappeared. His superiors had turned away, and the city looked at the bridge as salvation, not seeing that it was built on bones. When he returned home, it was already past midnight. The door of the apartment creaked, and he froze, waiting for a shadow, but saw only darkness. Maria was asleep, her face tense, as if even in her sleep she sensed trouble. Dima was lying in his room, his blanket tangled, and on the table there was a drawing. Not a bridge, but a river, black and endless, like an abyss that called Alexey. He sat by his son's bed, his hands still shaking, and for the first time in years he felt that his fear of heights was not a weakness, but an instinct that was trying to save him from the fall that had already begun. In the morning he found his car with a broken window. On the seat lay a shard of concrete, its edges sharp as a blade, and on it another letter. I, scratched so hard that the concrete crumbled. Alexey stood looking at the shard and felt the river in the distance laughing at him, as if it knew that his struggle was just a dance before the end. He knew that the bridge was almost finished, and he knew that his time was running out like blood from a wound, that no one would stop it. The river roared like a beast awakened by pain, its waters boiling under a sky that had burst into rain. The city was suffocating, its streets drowning in streams that carried garbage and hopes into the black maw of the sewers. Alexey Ivanov stood on the bank, his coat soaking wet, his hair plastered to his face, his eyes inflamed from lack of sleep, looking at the bridge, his bridge, that towered over the river like a tombstone ready to collapse. Today was the day of the opening, the day of triumph that he did not want, but could not avoid. His hands, crusted with dried blood and dirt, clutched the railing of the embankment, their coldness the only thing that kept him from falling into the abyss that had already opened up inside him. Week had passed since the night at the construction site, where he had found cracks and letters carved like a death sentence. A shard of concrete with his initials lay in the trunk of the car, heavy as the truth he had not had time to carry. He had sent the pictures to the police anonymously, putting them in an envelope he had dropped in the mailbox in the rain. But there had been no answer. Only a silence that was louder than a scream. Maria had looked at him as if he were a stranger, her gaze sharp as the glass that had shattered in their car. Dima, Their son had stopped drawing, his hands clutching books now, as if words could save him from the world that was crumbling around him. Alexey knew his family was the last thing he had left, but even they were slipping away like shadows in a downpour. The opening ceremony began under umbrellas that trembled in the wind. The officials in black suits smiled, their voices amplified by microphones, mocking the river that boiled below. Alexey stood in the crowd, his face hidden by a hood, but he felt the gazes, not of people, but of the bridge, whose arches looked at him like eyes that knew everything. He had not been invited, his name erased from the lists, as if he had never drawn these plans, had not stood at the heights, fighting fear. But he came because he could not help himself. The bridge was his fate, his curse, his grave. The crowd moved forward, people walked along the bridge, their steps humming like drums before an execution. Alexey watched the children laugh. The adults take pictures not seeing the cracks, which he knew by heart. He noticed Dima, his son, walking with the class, his jacket bright red, like a signal that he had not yet realized. Alexey's heart sank. He wanted to shout, to stop, but his voice was stuck like a bone in his throat. He stepped forward, pushing people, but the crowd was thick as tar, and he did not have time. The rain came down harder, its drops hitting the bridge like bullets, and then he heard a sound, not thunder, not wind, but a low, guttural groan that came from the depths of the structure. The bridge shook, its supports, which Alexey had seen cracked, began to sag like bones breaking under weight. People's screams flared like sparks, their voices mixing with the roar of metal bending like paper. Alexey ran, his feet slipping on the wet asphalt, but all he saw was Dima's red jacket flashing among the falling bodies. The Opora was the first to fall, its concrete cracking like a skull, and the bridge tilted, pulling people into the river. Alexey reached the edge, his hands clinging to the railing, but it bent like straw. He watched Dima fall, his eyes full of terror, meeting his father's for a split second before the river swallowed him. Alexey screamed, his voice hoarse as a beast's howl, but the river didn't listen. It took everything as it always did. The crowd scattered, the sirens wailed, but Alexey stood, his body as still as stone, his soul as torn as a bridge. He looked at the water where debris, jackets, bags, lives floated. His fear of heights had vanished, dissolved in a pain greater than any abyss. He knew it was his fault, not because he had built the bridge, but because he had not stopped those who had, made it deadly. The counterfeit bills, the rusted steel, the shadows that watched him. All of it had been part of the machine that had ground up his son, his life, himself. Maria found him an hour later, her face wet from more than just the rain. She didn't scream, she didn't hit him. She just looked, and her gaze was worse than any blow. She left without saying a word, her steps disappearing into the noise of the city, which was already forgetting about the tragedy. Alexey was left alone, his hand still clutching the railings that had miraculously survived, but they were empty, like his future. He returned to the river at night, after the rescuers had left and the reporters were tired of filming. The wreckage of the bridge jutted out of the water, its edges glinting in the moonlight like the teeth that had gnawed away his life. Alexey sat on the bank, his coat heavy with mud and water, a shard of concrete with the letter I in his pocket. He looked at the river, and it looked back at him, its waters calm, as if sated. He remembered the boy he had been, standing on this same bank 30 years ago, and realized that his fear of heights was not about heights, but about falling, not of his body, but of his soul, drowning in a truth he could not change. His shadow fell on the water, merging with the shadow of the bridge, which was no longer a bridge but a ruin, like his life. Alexey knew that the guilty ones, those who signed the bills, who hid behind the shadows, would remain in the shadows, as always. His struggle was in vain. His son was lost. His family was destroyed. The river flowed without stopping, and he felt it calling him, as it called the man in the coat who had jumped into its arms. He did not move, but his soul was already falling, and this fall was endless, like the abyss that always awaited him.